Hello, listeners. Welcome to another archive episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
We are going way, way back, Alex, to a very early episode, episode 42, when we were young guns, and also we hadn't had a global pandemic. But this episode was part of a series of episodes, special episodes, that we recorded live at the Cinema Museum in front of a very willing and able audience, talking about a particular film there, and a filmmaker as well that I know that you've written about. So why don't you do the honours?
Yeah, this is Ralph Bakshi's Wizards, a film I have a huge amount of time for. Do you remember a single frame of this movie, Christopher Holliday?
I remember one single frame, but that's only because it's on the front cover of our book.
Sure, of course, and even I'd somehow forgotten that. So look at us. Yes, this is the still from Wizards is on the front cover, but I was quite keen for that because I love the movie so much. And yes, a chapter on it. I think Bakshi is a really I mean, he's an ambivalent figure and an interesting figure and a mysterious figure in many ways. But I think his films are really rich, and I can't stop watching them. And I think Wizards is one of his best. It's mad, it's weird, it's crunky, it's a bit slapdash, kind of purposely slow. But if you haven't seen it, pause it, watch it, come listen to the archive of us chatting about it with a bunch of enthusiasts at the Cinema Museum in London all those years ago.
Yep.
I'm just going to shut up and let us all listen to it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as I wish you would for all of our episodes.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I am Alex Sargent.
I am Chris Holliday.
You seemed unsure about that.
I know, I paused when I didn't need to pause. For a minute I thought, am I Alex Sargent this week? No, I am still me.
You are still Christopher Holliday. It's probably the film of choice this week that's done this to you, Chris.
Yes.
Because it's a somewhat psychedelic experience that we're talking about in this film, which is Ralph Bakshi's Wizards, 1977 high fantasy epic Wizards. And our first Bakshi.
Somebody who I think has been a touchstone through previous episodes at various points.
Yeah, I can't believe if we haven't mentioned Bakshi before.
That would be strange. We'll go back and edit him and back in to the
kind of like Anakin. What's it? Hayden Christensen him back into the previous.
So we're gonna reboot the archive and retrospectively add in mentions to Bakshi. You mentioned in your little description actually that Bakshi, or this is Bakshi's epic, and I think that is a description. Or the word epic suits the film particularly well. Again, in a very early podcast, we did Yellow Submarine, and we talked, I remember quite vividly, about how the film gave me a headache.
Yes.
Similar. Mark II.
I see.
It's yes. I mean, Bakshi's somebody who I've known within my work on animation as this sort of independent, iconoclastic. I don't know, the anti-Disney, but it's very difficult to not find a history of animation that doesn't feature certainly US animation. I think
he's probably best known for two things. I think
yes.
He's probably best known for Fritz the Cat and his first adaptation of The Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
So that should give you a taster of what Wizards is like, really, 'cause it's somewhat in between those two worlds. However, Chris, and this is a big however.
Yes.
That classic phrase that everyone says. We actually have already chatted about Wizards.
We have already talked about this film.
Yes.
So
here's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
This is another live episode.
Where's it live? Where was it coming from?
Live at the Cinema Museum as part of our monthly screening series.
Yes.
There will be one more of these this year. We've really enjoyed our time there. But the last one, we're going out with a bang. We're going to do Yellow Submarine, one we featured on this podcast before. So you can get your tickets on the Cinema Museum website, cinemamuseum.org.uk.
Something like, oh God.
We don't actually know. Chris is going to furiously Google.
Yeah.
We should know this by now.
Yes, we should.
Cinemamuseum.org.uk.
Right, you were
nailed
right.
it. Nailed it. So you can buy tickets there, but you can also find information on our website, fantasy-animation.org. So we're going to jump to the live event now, and you'll hear us on stage just after the screening, have a chat about it and talk with the audience. A really lively audience this time. Some people was just absolutely loved it and were really going with it. Others had some issues, which I think were really important to raise, and I'm glad we got to talk through some of the more problematic aspects of Bakshi. But,
and it seemed like, certainly coming across from the audience, there was a sense sense of nostalgia. A lot of people haven't seen it since it came out, or they remembered going to the cinema to see it, and this was an opportunity to sit in the cinema museum and the kind of fabulous location of the museum itself and discuss what was Bakshi's first fantasy film.
And there were plenty who had never seen it and sort of had heard about it and were interested.
And I was one of them.
You were one of them, as I think I mentioned.
Right at the start.
I take delight in pointing out your ignorance.
Sure.
And we chatted about it, and here's the podcast, really. So
sit back.
I guess a very quick plot synopsis.
Yes.
Because we've
Good
done
luck.
this before.
Good luck with this.
It's a dystopic epic. It's set in thousands of years in the future. Fairies have come back. There's been a nuclear war.
So it's kind of post-apocalyptic in its...
But it also quite high fantasy in its sort of iconography. And basically it's about a battle between two brothers, Avatar and Black Wolf. Avatar basically represents the force of magic, of mysticism, of nature. He's very Lord of the Ringsy. Well, sort of. He also has a cigar and sounds like Columbo. So...
Part Gandalf, part Monopoly Man.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. But essentially that, and then we also have Black Wolf, who is a sort of dark wizard plotting to overthrow the fairy kingdom, and uses, amongst other things, Nazi propaganda, which he's found to inspire his troops to go out and commit these acts of violence. So it's a really, as you can perhaps tell from this description, odd but fascinating movie, which we delve in with our audience.
One thing to mention, that Alex gave an introduction to the film when we actually screened it, and for those of you who have purchased or familiar with the book Fantasy Animation, Connections Between Mediums and Genres, still available. The front cover of the book is from this film, so it's a very important film, I think, for us when we were thinking about this fantasy animation project. What would the front cover of a potential book look like? And so I feel like that this image that we settled on finally, the poster for Bakshi's Wizards, is a good sort of encapsulation of some of the things that I think we're interested in.
So we'll shut up here in the studio, and we will jump to the live event, and we will see you at the end.
Time renews tomorrow when we've used today. It will find the sorrow and wash it all away. Love can play a new tune on this carousel. It may be tomorrow, but only
Okay, we'll make a start because the night is not young, and
Neither are we.
Neither are we. So I'll let you all digest what we just saw there for a few minutes. It's quite a bamboozling film. Chris, don't worry, is in your boat in that Chris has, until 2 hours ago, not seen this movie either. Correct. Which has been a bone in contention in our working relationship. So now that riff is finally healed. So we'll chat for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so, give our 2 cents on the movie. But we're looking forward to hearing what everyone has to say. If you've got a question or a comment or a thought, do share it, and we'll be delighted to hear from you. So, Chris, would you like to start us off by giving us your first impressions on a movie that you hadn't seen until 2 hours ago?
Sure. I mean, funny enough, this comes at the same time as I've just taught this week my undergraduate students animation and propaganda, animation, politics and propaganda. And we've been looking at it in a particular way. We were looking at the Disney studio, and we were looking at Golden Age Hollywood and how animation was sort of wielded as a sort of political tool in its relationship to kind of propaganda. Whereas this film obviously opens up a new set of connections with propaganda, insofar as it part of its mixed media aesthetic that was particularly striking to me. Obviously, it's a mixed media aesthetic both within individual shots and across, within individual shots and then across scenes and sequences. So you have this collage effect that seems to lend itself really well to the message that it's trying to articulate, I think, and also the way in which it I mean, I don't know, we've had previous conversations on our podcast about the relationship between live action and animation and what it means when a film combines the two, and what sort of spectatorial address that is inviting, whether or not we're supposed to see them as different, or whether actually what we're supposed to do is think of them as occupying the same world and having perhaps the same sort of potency. So I got that a little bit from kind of watching the film. And also I think within Bakshi's, I'm familiar with actually other Bakshi movies, and this film seemed to from what you were describing in your introduction, seemed to gesture back to Fritz the Cat. There were moments of Fritzness, if you like, but it also seemed to anticipate one of my favourite Bakshi films, American Pop, which is again this sort of mixed media collage that tells its story through music, a particular story of an American family. So it seemed to open up questions about animation's relationship to politics and propaganda, and its kind of mixed media aesthetic and the contribution of that to that sort of potency, but also, I mean, and you're the Bakshi expert amongst us, that's sort of the film's pivot point or a transitional film as his first fantasy film, but also one that gestures back as much as it looks forward. So I guess from your perspective as the non-Luddite in the room, if you like, I guess I was interested in your positioning of the film and where this comes within Bakshi's back catalogue and what it sort of says about his relationship to fantasy, because certainly from an animation studies perspective, which is largely where I'm coming from, Bakshi is sort of always positioned as the, he's the periphery to Disney's core or Disney's center, and he's always sort of marginalized and positioned as this anti-authoritarian, independent animator versus the machine-like Disney studio. So I couldn't help reading the relationship in the film between technology and magic as sort of gesturing in some way, I don't know in what way, but in some way to that. But this is Bakshi's, I think you said, like his first venture into this kind of fantasy.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, Bakshi's was most prolific in the 1970s. This is his fourth film in 8 years. So and fourth film overall. He would go on to make another one this decade. And then two more in the early 80s, and then by about 1985, he's made one more feature film since. So he had this sort of hotbed of productivity for about 15 years, exploding onto the scene with a film, as I said in the introduction, called Fritz the Cat, but then making two other sort of socio-realist satires, Heavy Traffic and Coonskin, a very controversial movie that has a lot of issues towards race and was banned at the time. In 1975 it came out, and this was his sort of comeback. So he'd had this explosion with Fritz the Cat, and then his career had sort of already hit the skits a few years later, and within attempts to understand his filmmaking, this is often positioned as the film where he goes mainstream. Which, if anyone, we've all just seen the movie, how little that makes sense as a narrative. I've got a quote here from a animation historian called Ginoberto Benzani, who's like a godfather of animation history. He has written literally, well, not literally, but the Bible of animation studies.
He's written his sort of thing is animation in its global context.
Yeah.
And Bakshi's always a moment in American animation, I think.
So this is a quote from him about Wizards, and he says that Wizards demonstrates little imagination in the handling of its themes and has a culture and a taste which panders to the passions and tastes of teenagers. So what he's saying there, this kind of quite clunky and a bit too simplistic. I mean, Benzanzi is an incredible animation scholar, and we're indebted to him, but quite a clunky narrative that basically says that he made these interesting sort of early social satires, these kind of crazy adult cartoons, and then he went mainstream and he made Wizards, and then he followed this up with his adaptation of Lord of the Rings, which he might be best known. But I don't think that works. I think actually this movie is as weird and subversive and countercultural as the movies that came before it. And it goes to the form, the content, which we could talk about, the allegory he's trying to set up, the sort of allusions to psychedelia, the allusions to hippie culture, the place of fantasy in the 1970s, but it also, just to relate back to Chris's point, relates to the form, the way the animation is made. It's purposely messy. It's purposely lo-fi. It's purposely scattershot. And this idea of the lack of polish, the lack of veneer, is actually quite a political statement in terms of animation in the 1970s, because it's sticking two fingers up to the man, and the man in this case is Disney. Disney is polished factory, perfect animation that looks terrific and is technically accomplished. This is the opposite in every single way, and it kind of revels in that.
Yeah, and I suppose the film with that Disney narrative, and again, it's very difficult when you're, I think, talking about a figure like Bakshi to always have to relate it. You know, it's the proving the negative that he is not Disney. Although it is,
but he does that actually. Like
yeah.
his entire career, he sort of follows himself around with headlines with stuff like, "This is a film to make Donald Duck gasp. Minnie Mouse Max would blush at Bakshi's Fritz the Cat. This sort of followed him throughout his career. And he was quite happy to make that comparison. So it's fair in that respect.
He's somebody that I always sort of turn to, again, sort of, I guess, thinking about animation's history. While Disney, as we know, didn't invent animation, he went some way to defining it, both visually, stylistically, aesthetically, but also as a viable economic industry. And so you have this sort of machine-like process that Disney himself, I guess, organized animation in a particular way, and then equally his historical relationship to technology. So Disney's relationship to color, Disney's relationship to sound, Disney's relationship to depth and dimension, and the advent of his multiplane camera, which we are still debating as to whether or not he stole the designs from another filmmaker, Lottie Reiniger. So his relationship...
Field on stage here in our last of our screening series.
And so his relationship Disney's relationship to technology, I think, seemed to be present, or that animation's connection to magic versus technology seems to be reflexively folded into the narrative. I mean, we've talked a lot about animated films that seem to be about animation, and so the idea of creation and animation and things like this. And so there's lots in the film, I think, about questions of autonomy and agency and puppet-like control, but also there are some scenes, I mean, you say that it's messy and lo-fi and deliberately so, but it is, in some ways, it does evoke the form and the look of a sort of a hyper-real Disney world, because if you think about Disney and then Warner Brothers in the 30s, 40s, 50s, then the end of that golden age and the rise of different studios that are working in much more abstract, geometric ways with scarcity of background and suggestion and are sort of prioritizing the modernity of form. So this, I'm thinking of mid-century America, United Production, so UPA, the American studio. This is not like that. This is, in some scenes, it is very luscious and Disney-esque, and what we would call kind of full animation. There is depth and dimension, and there is kind of detail within the scenes. That's not continuous, and it doesn't go from shot to shot. And there is this jarring quality in the film that moves between something that is recognizably, and I'm loath to use the Disney aesthetic in this case, but something that is recognizably Disney, balanced with a sort of rotoscoping you mentioned in the introduction, so the copying of live action, and in particular a film, the rotoscoping over footage.
It's a Sergei Eisenstein movie. Sergei Eisenstein, the great sort of silent Soviet filmmaker. Alexander Nevsky. There is some other footage that I don't know where it's from. I did at one point, but it's escaped me. But a lot of it is taken from a Russian silent movie.
And of course live action. So it's use of live action footage and characters within the film that are watching this footage. So it's doing something very, I agree that its animation aesthetic in places is lo-fi, but actually in others it's very kind of luscious, I think.
It's not cohesive though. It's not.
No, exactly.
It's not all one thing. And again, I think that feeds into the narrative, in that the whole point of the narrative, or at least some of the subtlety of the narrative, is this idea of rejection of homogeny and celebration of different forms, different cultures.
But therefore, it seems
it's anti-authoritarian.
But then it plays out visually what it then engages with narratively, i.e. the question of, one, cynicism, but also a kind of hysteria. And they talk at points about hysteria, and obviously thematically you could connect that to obviously war, the futility of war, etc., etc. But visually there is a stylistic hysteria to the way that it is moving quite. The only thing that's cohesive about it is its incoherency. And there is that sort of movement between different styles and forms and aesthetics that I think, the mixed media certainly gives. Well, one, I think it gives animation the status of live action. It doesn't actually, in many cases, distinguish between the two. It's sort of, animation could equally make a political point as live action, and that's what I've spent this week telling my students. But also, I think it sort of maps onto a narrative of hysteria, something that plays out as much in its form as it does in its content.
The only other thing I'd like to talk about before we open it out is the cultural status of fantasy during this period. One of the reasons Bakshi's fantasy movies, quote unquote, are often written off in his filmmaking career is a misunderstanding from historians post the event of what fantasy means in the context of sort of mid-century America, 1960s, 1970s America in particular. This is an era in which it is not cool to like Dungeons and Dragons. In fact, it's cool to like Dungeons and Dragons because it's not cool. to like Dungeons and Dragons. And I think with the sort of rise of Comic-Con and the rise of sort of mainstream geek culture, the geeks have taken over the world and all this kind of, Big Bang Theory stuff that's happened in the last sort of 20 years, we forget what a marginal, subversive little genre fantasy, or at least this type of fantasy, high fantasy, alternative world, complex mythologies, all this sort of stuff means to people. This is an era in which fantasy is talked about as freaks and geeks. It's conventions met around the corner. It's garage sales. It's meeting around your mates to play Dungeons and Dragons in your parents' basement because no one else will let you. It's that kind of era, and this film did really well. It was Bakshi's second highest-grossing movie after Fritz the Cat. Lord of the Rings eventually did better overall, but theatrical release alone, this one is second. But it didn't have a major release. It toured like colleges. Bakshi literally went round college campuses doing Q&As, sort of promoting the movie, and he sold them to select theatres, and he knew what his audience was, and his audience weren't, the lascivious passions and tastes of teenagers. They were, people. They were college kids. They were Vietnam protesters. They were, civil rights activists. And the film spoke to them. It was sort of countercultural. It was cool. It was radical. It was weird. This is the era in which Led Zeppelin are putting Lord of the Rings references in their films, in their songs, and Jefferson Airplane are writing songs about Alice in Wonderland. Fantasy's cool because it's not cool, and that's forgotten about. This isn't Disney. This is another kind of fantasy.
Well, also that maps again quite nicely onto a narrative, or the narrative of American animation, because this film is 10 years, just over 10 years after Disney himself dies, and certainly within the chronology of Disney animation, this film is arriving at a period where, and I think you've termed this in a chapter, sort of Disney's dark ages, where it doesn't really know, it's sort of lost its way. This is the default and received narrative, whether or not that's actually true, because it's one also equally perpetuated by the studio as a way of gearing up to a Little Mermaid style renaissance. So there's something quite interesting about when this film is released. The animation itself, I guess, is moved a little bit towards television. So this is only 5 years as well before the television adaptation of Dungeons and Dragons, which you've recently done an episode on as well. And so again, this is a film that is perhaps, again, in the production that you've described, and Bakshi's relationship, fantasy's relationship, or cultural standing. There's something, again, interesting about how animation at this point isn't front and center the theatre per se. It's moving into different spaces onto television and touring around kind of college campuses as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's breaking away from a sort of fairy tale form of animation that Disney has popularized, that's very much associated with the man. It's Hollywood isn't cool.
Well, actually, that is my first note on the film itself, that the opening sequence, if you think of all the Disney movies that begin with the book and the voiceover and the sense of storytelling and narration that is then that then sort of sets up the fairy tale tradition. This, I think I've just put the words monstrous reimagining of the storybook, because it could be drawings from a storybook, but they're these sort of post-apocalyptic images with this very sort of macabre voiceover. So immediately I think the film is maybe gesturing, and again it is difficult to not, or to always, or maybe it's wrong to always talk about Bakshi in terms of his relationship to Disney, but I think in this instance the way that the film opens is a sort of conscious way of thinking about how stories are told.
Some behind-the-scenes trivia on that. The recurring voiceover that keeps coming back, and we keep going back to these sort of still images, was basically done at the last minute because they ran out of money. So as I said at the beginning, this was a very quick shoot. It was about somewhere between 9 and 11 months, which is insane for a feature animation. And I think he was only working with a team of somewhere of around sort of 10 to 20 animators. So really sort of not what you would normally do. And they literally ran out of money to film some key sequences. So he stuck a voiceover to explain the bits in, and he was worried it wasn't going to make any sense. I wonder why he worried that, but he was worried that it wasn't going to make any sense, so he put in a very clear, cohesive voiceover at the beginning that really sets
Chewed
up.
his way at that bit.
Yeah. But it's really interesting. Again, it adds to this mixed media sort of collage effect because it's another effect. The graphics are done by an artist called Mike Plug, who worked with Marvel at the time, and there's a whole other sort of thing we could talk about in terms of this film is also riffing on sort of comic book culture because again, fantasy's not cool. It's read by comics. Comics are disdained. They're not the multi-million-pound franchises that we know them to be today.
Stop talking.
This feels like a preemptive pause to the episode.
Yes, so we've stopped talking for the moment about whatever.
Well, we stopped talking then, and now we're going to talk now about Twitter and about social media, I guess, more broadly.
Yeah, well, just the basic stuff as usual, everybody. Please do follow us on Twitter if you have Twitter, Fananim Research, FANANIM Research. Follow us on Facebook, Fantasy Animation. You can find it in the groups in the group or
an event or
I don't know. We're one of those. You'll find
Yeah.
us. We've got a lovely logo. You'll see us. You can. What else can they do, Chris?
They can visit the website. They can get in touch via the website and kind of look at our back catalogue, if you like, our greatest hits of podcasts, of blogs. If you'd like to contribute to the blog, then please do get in contact via social media, as we'd love to hear from you.
Tell what else you can do. You can subscribe to the podcast on whatever format you're on. So if you're on anything other than Apple Music, you simply subscribe, and that will boost our rankings and on the algorithms will give us a helping hand, and that will mean more people will see us. So that would be really handy. And if you are on Apple Podcasts, I believe it's called these days, give us a quick star rating and maybe an actual little review, just
little
a couple
comment.
of sentences. The star ratings are coming in, which is really great. We could do with another review just to freshen things up a little bit. It looks like at the moment people have stopped listening, so that's not good.
Yes.
We want it to look like everyone is enjoying it, even if that is not the case.
Otherwise, I'm this close to writing a review of it myself, and we don't want that.
No, we don't want that. If you do write a review yourself, what code word will you put in it so that people know it's got that desperate and we really need your help?
That's a good question. Operation Bakshi.
Operation Bakshi.
Operation Bakshi.
Operation Bakshi. If Chris has to resort to Operation Bakshi, we've got problems. So please go out there and do it yourselves. Thanks. Right, we'll shut up and not shut up, but keep talking about other things.
I think we could see what you guys think of it, though. That's our thoughts. We have a roaming mic that's going around the room. If you can wait for the mic to reach you before you say your question, otherwise we'll have to make you repeat it for our listeners at home. So if anyone got a question or a
maybe
comment,
just their thoughts on the film,
or some thoughts on the film, we'd love to have a conversation. Yeah, there's one at the back and then one at the front. We'll go to the back first.
Thank you. And then these awkward silences we just cut out of the podcast.
Yeah, so it's all
happy
gravy.
days.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I'd never seen it before, and I thought it was just incredible. I really enjoyed it. I don't really have a question. I just wanted to give an impression, really. But I think when you talk about mixed media, how he used mixed media, I think one of the things that really struck me was obviously the story was largely about the sort of conflict or collision between magic and technology, between sort of fantasy and science. And I kind of felt like the conflict between the artwork and then suddenly just these images of Adolf Hitler, which when they came up were really quite shocking. There was this real collision there between different types of media, but also between different types of artwork as well, because the style of artwork was very, very different and sort of overlaid with each other in different parts of it, which I found fascinating. So there was this like constant collision of styles, which I really felt while watching it kind of kept me on my toes and kind of kept me sort of surprised all the time. And I also, the other thing I wanted to say was I kept thinking all the way through it, was there some kind of political, philosophical point here about this idea of a projector projecting images from the Second World War that are just completely mesmerizing everybody and kind of entrancing people, like they're kind of, captured by this spectacle that sort of takes over everyone's minds almost. And there's something very kind of politically metaphorical about that, I think.
No, absolutely. And the way that you've, I think, described the way that the film uses it. It's not that it's mixed media, it's that the way that it uses it and the idea of projection. I mean, if you go back through film history, there are so many films like that, whether it's Shan Andalou, whether it's Man with a Movie Camera, Battleship Potemkin, that are about sight and the assault on vision, essentially. And I feel that this film sort of does that as well. Those sort of reflexive gestures to filmmaking, the power of images, the idea of kind of indoctrination, and again, I don't know whether that's saying something about. It is a collision between live action and animation. As I said, we've talked previously about what that means in terms of an active spectatorship. Are you encouraged to view them as different, that live action tells the truth, photographic images tell the truth, and animation does the rest? Or are we asked in this film to sort of think of them on par, or as equally as potent and powerful, and have that ability to be loaded with political content, I guess?
There's something about the images where we have the animated characters watching the live action footage that's very powerful, and it's something about the jarring of this sort of comic book aesthetic with these images that were sort of engraven within our sort of cultural psyche of these sort of traumatic events. Photographs, preservations of the past, and that the fact that these things are trying to place together, and particularly if you think about this film, is actually a dystopic fantasy. So it is claiming in the narrative some sort of lineage between the images of photographs and the sort of cartoon images that we're seeing there. It's really striking, and it's like viewing the world through a strange lens, and I don't think I quite know what Bakshi is trying to say with it. I've listened to a few of his interviews, and there's actually a director's commentary on the Blu-ray that's really interesting. Most of it is him apologising for various budgetary concerns, but he does try and sort of numerate on the themes, and he sort of is trying to get at this sort of anti-authoritarian, anti-fascist, the power of art to provoke the imagination over the sort of the authoritative, and to inspire individual creativity. I think there's a muddiness to the metaphor. I'm not quite sure quite what it's getting at. I don't think that's a problem. I think that can be a source of energy, because I think this film's lack of decipherability is part of its pleasure. On the subject of the sort of various clashing styles, you're quite right. And again, behind the scenes, what he would do is sort of basically hire different comic book artists he befriended to design different bits of the movie. So, as I say, Mike Ploog did a lot of the sort of fairy voiceover stuff, but the scenes in Scorch, the Black Wolf's Palace, are done by a comic book artist called Ian Miller, who was famous for doing a lot of illustrations of H.P. Lovecraft, so those angular images you might have seen on there. And he also did a lot of D&D, Dungeons and Dragons imagery as well. So not from the world of animation, from the world of sort of comic art and fantasy illustration. And banging those things together creates this sort of, we use the phrase oil and water a lot on the podcast. You stir it and you stir it and you stir it, and it never comes together, but it looks very beautiful as it sort of dances around the glass. Two absolutely excellent observations there. Yeah, I completely agree. It gives the film great energy. I think we had a question or a comment on the front.
Hi, yeah, I loved it. I thought it was really nice to look at and stuff. I like drawing and illustration and everything. But I thought it was interesting how, because it started off really promising for me in terms of like political allegory, and the mother, because it sort of started off as like a matriarchy with this queen fairy, and she has these two twins, and one's bad and one's good, and the good one like grieves her death, and the bad one like doesn't give a shit, and it's about this sort of relationship to the mother, and also this stuff about technology versus nature, and the guy says that the only true technology is nature, and I kind of thought, yeah, man, he's on to like, 'cause, I was sort of thinking, yeah, nature is like, Mother Nature is like the feminine, and like patriarchy is this sort of necrophilic death cult of technology, and
there's a however or a but coming there. I'm sensing.
Yeah. And
then
but both the twins, Avatar and the evil one, both end up with these sort of infantilized, pornified girlfriends, and you kind of hope that Avatar would end up with I don't know, the fairy woman Eleanor. She was like a bit kick-ass, but basically she was just wearing that ridiculous porn bikini for the whole thing. And I think it's a shame, because I think back she was sort of on something. You could go on about how countercultural and radical it all is, and he hated the Nazis and everything, but I think it's massively let down by, you know, the sort of depictions of women in it, which I thought started off really prominent. I thought it started off possibly as like a sort of feminist thing, but it wasn't to be. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Thanks for raising. I think it's. I think I had written, "Will someone mention Eleanor?" in my notes? ? And yeah.
Well, I suppose this is, I think at those moments, that's what I mean about its relationship to something like Fritz the Cat, and perhaps it's a gesture towards that kind of, Bakshi making sure he ticks the box of somebody who is known for quote-unquote adult animation. Adult animation, you can define in lots and lots of ways. He is the adult animator, and so at those moments, yeah, absolutely the decision to dress Eleanor or undress Eleanor in that particular way, for me I was thinking, oh, okay, so here we go, classic Bakshi, and actually it was then the rest that was a bit new and a bit different. But I feel like you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, I describe Bakshi as a countercultural animator. I don't describe him as a progressive animator.
No, I mean,
no, and I'm not excusing it. I think you're exactly right. I think,
but it's the fact that it was like so close to kind of. That, like, actually what he's saying about technology and nature being the only technology, like, that is actually really quite radical. And
Yeah.
And he's like really getting. He could have. I don't know. It could have been more in. I think as a fantasy sort of narrative and everything with political, obviously, political undertones to it and everything. I think it could have been. It was almost like a lot more radical than it ended up being. Like, he ended up being a bit of a Nazi with it, really, because all the women in it are just porn stars. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I do. I think that's kind of almost that's a trait.
And all the
that's
bad
throughout.
women are old and haggard. You know when Eleanor's all tied up and the evil woman is going, kill her, and she's got saggy boobs, and she's a kind of, and the whores in it are all kind of old, and it's like the bad women are ugly and the good women are young and nubile. It's all, it's just all very,
but there's that woman with green, that woman with green who's holding a baby.
Yep.
Where are the wise hags in it? Where are the wise hags? Like,
This is a trait throughout his whole. So Fritz the Cat. People think Fritz the Cat is this like really cool, subversive, leftist film. It's not. It's about a cat who wants to have sex and basically tries anything to have sex with anything that moves. He mocks the left. He mocks the right. There are dealings in grotesque imagery. We could talk about his depiction of race because it's problematic. There are scenes in Fritz the Cat where a bunch of pigs who are identified as being Jewish in the movie, and it's trying to make some sort of really crass humor out of that. Coonskin is a movie that got him into serious trouble, and it's a movie that is a sort of really twisted re-envisioning of Song in the South, which is a movie with its whole other backstory, but it's definitely trading in racial stereotypes. All of this is there. All of this is there and knocks and is difficult and doesn't help understand the movie. In fact, it helps energize the desire to keep kind of watching it because you think it might all click into gear one time, and it doesn't because there's that scene in it. And why on earth is Avatar basically Columbo? And what is all this about? And where's the cigars coming from? And it's he's counterculture in the sense that he's not doing what we think he should do, for better and for worse. And that's what I kind of find interesting about it. It's not the stuff. It's the stuff I like and the stuff that I just can't wrap my head around. And you're absolutely right. He loves.
I thought Avatar would end up with I don't know. I thought there'd be some more sort of eco-feminist moral to it all. No.
I think that he's too much of an impish kind of filmmaker. I think the moment he senses that he should do something, he does the opposite. For better or for worse. And he loves to deal with stereotypes, and he loves to deal with grotesque imagery. And Chris can talk more about this than I can. But the grotesque is such a difficult thing to play with, because you can lampoon with the grotesque, but you can also be nasty and suppress with the grotesque, and I suspect he does both without knowing it at the same time, and neither.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of knife edge that animation falls in terms of whether it's able to dilute versus whether it's able to exaggerate. And it's always, and this goes back to animation's relationship to children, and how do we think about the ideological loading of messages within cartoons? Well, it's fine because they're diluted because it's animation, versus no, look at how animation is this veneer that has somehow covered or veiled these really insidious images, and rather than diluting it, actually to draw it is to then commit to it, and then to commit to it is to exaggerate it. But it is interesting that the film is then bookended by these two very colourful, luscious scenes of like nature, almost as if he's trying to get away with, like, it's fine because I've tacked this bit on at the end where it's all colourful and we're back to kind of normality, and that sort of machine age that takes up an hour and 10 minutes of the film is sort of, they're trying to make us forget about it because of these bits at the end that are playing a bit more with nature, or the return to nature. Maybe that's what I mean in terms of the conclusion, that the film tries to play with that. Yes, and now we've returned to nature, and this is all, Pride Rock is now colourful again. We have a question, probably, yeah.
Thanks very much. So I haven't seen this since the early 80s, and it's been fantastic watching it again. And some of the things that struck me then as a kid still strike me in slightly different ways. One of them, this is my intro to the artwork of Ian Miller, which has stuck with me since. His backdrops in this are amazing. And he goes on to become a Tolkien illustrator, just as Ralph Bakshi goes on to direct the Lord of the Rings animated film. As a kid, I was obsessed with the character Peace, and the pathos of that character continues, I think, to really stand out in the film, and I really enjoyed seeing that again. And the subversion of the sort of the Titanic clash at the end, where you're expecting a big magic battle, and Avatar just pulls a gun and shoots his brother, and it's just totally turns on its head how a fantasy film or something should end with lots of magic and so on. And something I didn't pick up at the time as a kid is Mark Hamill was in the background there as one of the voice actors. So that was fun to
what else he was doing in 1977.
Yeah, this is his downtime one. But thanks very much for screening this.
Well, actually, I think that point about the fight at the end is, I wonder whether that's the moment where you said that Bakshi's trying to do things or do things that we don't expect him to do. So it's as much a reflection on genre as much as it is anything else, but also it feeds back into what seems to be the film's relationship to technology. If the film is about technology versus magic, and animation is essentially both of those things, it is a technology that tries to pass itself off as magic in some ways. And so actually, I wonder whether the gun is much like the images of Hitler, or the record, the playing camera, the projection. It's the danger of technology and the threat of the machine. I don't know. And in that you could read a sort of anti-Disney agenda, but I don't think it's as clear cut as that. I think it's more at that moment a play on genre for me anyway.
Yeah, I'd agree, and it doesn't actually sort of make much thematic sense, I don't think, because there's a whole sort of thing set up between. The forces of magic don't wield weapons, and the forces of technology do, and they wield swords and all that sort of stuff. But I don't know what that sort of. I agree that it's kind of it always surprises me. I always forget, and this sort of the chaos of the final battle. And what I do think is impressive is there's a sense of scale in that final battle that is not on screen. It's sort of in between the various sort of combinations of background footage, violence. The violence against fantasy imagery is quite interesting here. Yeah, there's something about seeing a fairy bleed that just doesn't seem to fit well. It's kind of when they're in the woods and the fairy gets shot by Peace, and it's quite disturbing, because it's this bleeding of genres. So yeah, but again, we're talking all about this, nice unification of chaotic form with sort of chaotic style. The next film, it's a year later, is Lord of the Rings. And in that film, he starts using rotoscope in this movie. He really uses it a lot in that. And that film, he was very keen to not have the animation be in any way more than a sort of realist illustration of the imagery. I think he described himself as wanting to be Rembrandt in Lord of the Rings, to sort of paint with the animation a scene that looks as realistic as possible. So even in the space of a year, he completely abandons one style, moves on to another style. He's a chaotic little critter. It's Bakshi.
He's fun to follow on Twitter too, by the way.
He's what? Sorry,
he's fun to follow on Twitter as well.
He is fun, and he knows tonight's is going on. So I will share.
We'll at him.
We'll at him as we do.
Do we have any final? Yeah, great.
Sorry, because it's next. Quick creative question.
Sure.
Did Bakshi ask Ian Miller to draw those images for the film, or did he actually borrow Ian Miller's pre-existing work? Because they're really creative opposites. Because Ian Miller's artwork, you look at that, just generally, you want to explore it and dive into it. It has that effect regardless. That's the fantasy element of it. But, he's literally doing what all kind of viewers of Ian Miller's work want to do. Or that's why Ian Miller's so popular in the role-play scene as well. Because you want to get inside those drawings. I don't think I've ever seen anyone do that before.
Yeah, no, I agree. And as I say, he's riffing on a form of fantasy that is sort of, on one hand, it's the literariness of Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, these sort of highbrow, these things that we now think of as highbrow novels, but, Tolkien was dismayed by the reception in the States of Lord of the Rings because it was picked up by, juveniles and stoners as far as he could see. The Oxford Don did not want any part of the way it was being received in the States. And it was being received alongside a sort of existing culture since the 30s and the 40s of pulp magazines, comics, weird tales, magazine of sci-fi and fantasy, the Edgar Rice Burroughs, Tarzan, Conan the Barbarian, all this kind of stuff that was already in US society. And Bakshi's definitely, he associates himself as being that kind of fantasy fan. And so all these references were within his world, certainly. So it's nice to see it. I agree, it sort of captures a nice culture on screen through its sort of various clashing styles and visualizations. Any further comments?
Yeah, I think we have one final question.
Make this last one.
Yeah.
And then we'll all
wrap up.
So I was wondering how you guys feel about the inclusion of Eisenstein's work, because I was wondering if you felt like Bakshi was trying to paint him in a positive or a negative light, because while, Eisenstein was working for someone who was obviously on the far left, I think most people would agree that Stalin was an authoritarian. So I was wondering if you guys think that
seems fair.
That painted his work and his films in a positive light or a negative light.
Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I think Bakshi, when he talks about the use of rotoscope, his narrative is very much it's a technical solution to a problem. He didn't have the funds to create these elaborate battle sequences, so he found the closest footage he was looking for and painted over it. So
the original footage isn't of political intrigue; it's more the image of certain.
I'm looking for an image of this kind of battle.
Right.
I'll find it in an Eisenstein movie and I'll use that. I think that narrative economy suits him very well. And what does he do with rotoscope is a really interesting question, and I'm not quite sure animation historians and theorists have really, or sort of anyone, has really got to grips with what rotoscoping does. Does rotoscoping capture, or does it embellish, or does it subvert? I mean, I guess it can do all three of those things. The way Bakshi talks about rotoscoping in his career, he tends to talk about it as a process of capturing. So I think there's a sense of honouring Eisenstein's work as a filmmaker, and that I suspect has less to do with the political allegiance between filmmaker and between Bakshi and Eisenstein as it is to do with sort of artistic leniency. So, bear in mind this is sort of 60s, 70s, the new American cinema, Scorsese, people like that have come along, raised on European art house traditions, raised on things like Eisenstein. These are all part of the popular canon of the cinephile. So I think that is more of an expression of or a sort of a gesture of topping the hat of cinephile to cinephile than it is anything sort of overtly political, as much as sort of cinephilia is kind of political. Well, it is political. So that's how he describes it, and that is my impression of it. I don't see Bakshi as having is making any sort of left-rightish statement with that, or that the footage is somehow condoning or celebrating the content of Eisenstein. We could even argue the opposite, might actually taking it out of the scene, out of context, and repoliticizing it or repurposing it can almost destroy the original intent
Part
of the
of
image.
that, I guess, because you talked about the lo-fi, but the sort of cut and paste aesthetic, I think, you're right, in terms of the timing of the film, seems to work within a broader culture of cinephilia in the way that it is combining, gestures. I suppose there are gestures to a Disney-style fairy tale as much as there are live-action 1920s, 1930s Soviet cinema montage, the use of editing. I was also thinking about Riefenstahl as well, Leni Riefenstahl's, that kind of political imagery that begins in the 30s, but then seems to recur in things like Lord of the Rings, The Lion King, Star Wars, all these sorts of certain kinds of right-wing imagery that are then perpetuated through, or that kind of right-wing imaginary that is solidified in certain kinds of films. So it is part cinephilia. I think it's part of that cut and paste aesthetic. And I think the question about rotoscoping, whether it is capturing or whether it is manipulating or whether it's isolating because it cut and pastes and takes things out of their context to then repoliticize, I think it's but I agree with you. I don't think it's articulating a message either one way or the other around Eisenstein as a filmmaker.
We have neither the time nor the patience for me to go on my probably hour rant about the clear traces of Bakshi's legacy in Peter Jackson's filmmaking, because it's writ large all over it, both from Wizards and from Lord of the Rings. So I'll just say that comment. Eisenstein, as a final, do you want to do you love your Eisenstein?
I do love my Eisenstein. My only, and I said this just before we were going to talk about this, is that Eisenstein obviously has an interesting relationship to animation anyway, and actually it ties in quite nicely with cut and paste, because Eisenstein wrote one of the earliest, if not the earliest, formal appreciations of animation in the 40s. He then died, and his work was only discovered in the 80s. And it was translated, and it was all notes. He'd written notes about Disney animation on bits of paper, and it was just scattered around. And then it was brought together in a book called Eisenstein on Disney that I think I bought for like £1.50 online. And it's just a collection of Eisenstein's notes on Disney. He talks about this idea of plasmaticness that is embedded within the cartoon images in and of themselves. So something that was happening in production, rubber hosing, characters with rubber hoses without joints. He then takes up in reception and talks about plasmaticness. He talks about animation's freedom from a mechanized existence in the 40s. He talks about the real world being graphed by the cent and the dollar, and how animation provides a kind of a freedom from ossification, a freedom from the once and forever given. So Eisenstein himself was very interested in Disney in particular, and animation's ability to articulate on screens actually some of the things that fantasy would then take up, metamorphosis, like transformation. I think at one point Eisenstein talks about Disney's ability to mock zoology by having animals that talk. And so that's my little note on Disney. But it's a great book and very, very, very cheap. But it is again, it's kind of chaotic because it's just these notes on animation that are cut and put together in this collage book that reflect his interest in animation. So it's a nice little link.
And it's nice to know that a Soviet propagandist can love Mickey Mouse at the same time.
Bingo.
I think that's it for tonight. Thank you very much for staying, and thank you very much for taking part in the Q&A. It's been really nice chatting to you all. We have the Dark Crystal next month, if anyone fancies some Skeksis, Mystics, puppets, and fantasy animation.
So
and then
that's on Friday, the 28th of February.
Yes, and then our last one of the series will be in March, where we'll be showing Yellow Submarine. Come to Pepperland. All you need is love.
And if you'd like to hear either one of the earlier podcasts that we've done at the Cinema Museum on the Adventures of Prince Ahmed, that is online. But do go back and listen to some of us chattering about. We chat to Oscar winners, we chat to academics, filmmakers, animators.
And sometimes to each other.
So thank you.
Thank you very much for coming. Hope you enjoyed the Bakshi. Cheers.
So that was, and still is, Wizards.
Yes,
That was our episode. It remains Wizards. It'll always be my wizard. Yeah, that was good fun. Having not seen the film, I was really, and again, as somebody who's found Bakshi at various points, whether it's class or research on something related to Hollywood animation, whether it's a question of his connections to adult animation. This was my first kind of dummy. I've seen a couple of Bakshis before, but this is my first engagement with his fantasy canon, if you like, his group of fantasy films. So adult in a different way, got me thinking a lot about magic and technology as we discussed. So yeah, I still kind of don't know what to make of it. My headache is still here, but that's a good thing.
Sure, I know. I've seen it loads of times, and I still don't know what to make of it. So as probably came across in the Q&A there. We'll almost certainly revisit Bakshi again at some point.
I'd love to. There's lots to say.
There's lots more to say about that. If you enjoyed that podcast, there is one more live event you can come to at the end of March. Yellow Submarine is the 27th of March.
This is the 27th of March.
27th of March. Buy tickets on the Cinema Museum website, cinemamuseum.org.uk, or you can just find it via our website, fantasy-animation.org. Is there anything else we have to say? I think that's us.
No, I think that's us. If you would like to contribute to if you're a Bakshi fan, any Bakshi fans out there, you listened to the podcast, you enjoyed the episode, or you disagreed with some of the things, or there are bits of his work that you'd like to shine a light on, then do get in touch via Twitter, Facebook. You can visit us at the website fantasy-animation.org. Pitch a post, pitch a sequence analysis, and yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. You can find us on Twitter at Fananim Research, FANANIM Research. You can find us on Facebook. I'm going to keep saying that we might exist on Instagram at one point, mainly as a reminder to me and to Chris to try and sort that out at some point.
If you keep saying it, it may happen.
Yeah, and that's us for another week. We'll see you next time.
Bye.